Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to this latest installment of the conversation of the UC Davis Humanities Institute entitled 400 Years of Resistance, Policing, and Abolition. My name is Jamie Fisher, and I'm a professor in the departments of German and Cinema and Digital Media, as well as the faculty director of the Davis Humanities Institute. Before we get started, I just want to send a special thank you to our DHI staff, especially to Gina Nunez and Kathy Wallerstein, who really planned today's event. The UC Davis Humanities Institute is a leading voice on our campus for the essential value of the arts and humanities. Part of the mission is to underscore how the humanities and arts can, and we think should, contribute to debates and controversies in the broader society. This can and should be true even in these trying times. So today we have chosen a topic we think is really essential to our current debates and to society right now. Our format will be that Kathy Wallerstein, our Associate Director of the UC Davis Humanities Institute, will be moderating the discussion. I'm going to hand it over to her in a second. And you are all welcome to post questions in the Q&A function of Zoom webinar. And then the questions will be screened and passed on to Kathy after we hear from our distinguished panelists. Okay, Kathy, so I'm handing it off to you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to 400 Years of Resistance, Race, Policing, and Abolition. I'm Kathy Wallerstein, Associate Director of the Davis Humanities Institute, and I'm so glad to be able to provide a platform for this important discussion and honored to be its moderator. This is an extraordinary moment. The convergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, the systemic racism and police violence that has always existed, but that has been rendered spectacularly visible in recent weeks, and a public international response of a magnitude absolutely inconceivable just 6 weeks ago suggests that we are truly living in a history-making moment, the kind we've been waiting for with revolutionary potential and promise. Joining us to discuss the promise and perils of the current moment are Doctors Andrea Boyles, Ofelia Cuevas, and Erin Gray. I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then we'll pose 4 to 5 questions to the 3 of them, which they'll answer individually and or together, after which we'll have about 20 minutes of Q&A. Okay, Andrea Boyles is a feminist race scholar, a sociologist, and critical criminologist. Her work accounts for social inequality and injustice relative to Black citizen police interactions, neighborhood disorder and disadvantage, community development and engagement, and resilience and collective action. Boyles has served in various capacities in academia and has worked with corporations and organizations, including but not limited to American Airlines, Amnesty International, and the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement. Boyles is author of You Can't Stop the Revolution, Community Disorder and Social Ties in Post-Ferguson America, that came out with UC Press in 2019. And Race, Place, and Suburban Policing, Too Close for Comfort, again UC Press, 2015. Ofelia Cuevas is an interdisciplinary scholar in the Department of Chicano Studies at UC Davis. Her research lies at the intersections of critical race studies, visual and cultural studies, and geography and law. Her work focuses on race, prisons, and policing, and interrogates the critical questions: what lives constitute an ethical crisis? And what is the contemporary value embedded in the practice of racial violence? She's currently completing her manuscript, Visuality of Violence, Watching and Witnessing the Policing of Race, which maps the historical continuities and discontinuities of policing and state violence on the material and discursive terrains of law, visual culture productions, and raced populations. She's also at work on a second book, Policing LA's Human Terrain, the Criminal Non-Human at Point Zero, which examines the Los Angeles County Jail as a critical point on the city's cartography of productive human terrain. And last but not least, Erin Gray is a post-disciplinary writer and assistant professor of Black literary and cultural studies in the English department at UC Davis. Writing and teaching at the intersections of critical theory and cultural studies, her research interrogates the aesthetic production of racist and anti-racist thought in the long 20th century. Erin's current book project, The Moving Image of Lynching, is an abolitionist critique of US lynching culture that theorizes the co-emergence and continuing imbrication of lynch law and racial liberalism as constitutive elements of US imperial power. Her co-edited anthology, The Black Radical Tradition in the United States, is forthcoming from Verso Press in 2021. Welcome to Andrea, Ofelia, and Erin. Thank you for being here. So for the first question, I'm going to ask quite simply, what do we mean by abolition historically and today? And Erin, you can go first.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank Catherine for organizing this event and inviting all of us to participate in it today. I also want to acknowledge the First Peoples on whose lands we gather, largely as uninvited guests, as we move into this discussion today. So UC Davis is housed on the historic homelands of the Patowin peoples, and I'm currently in Oakland, or occupied Ohlone territory. So what do we mean by abolition? Abolition is an assemblage of revolutionary political praxes, theoretically engaged practices that move us toward collective liberation. Abolition is a movement that seeks to overturn racial capitalism by ending the criminal punishment system or the criminal injustice system, and transforming our attachment to forms of security that are rooted in domination and punitive and frankly white supremacist notions of justice, and transforming those into practices of accountability and networks of care that center the experiences and consciousness of survivors of harm. So calls to abolish police arise most immediately from the movement to abolish the prison industrial complex, which means, yes, closing prisons and ending policing in all its forms. So ending immigration enforcement, ending border patrol, ending private security, ending military forces, ending community policing, and replacing the current carceral regime with a system that values life, that meets everyone's basic needs, and that allows us to respond to incidents of harm without treating anybody as a disposable enemy, right? And that's really where the rub comes in. That's where the difficult work of creating, different systems for responding to harm really begins, right? And it's incredibly difficult to imagine not disposing our enemies, right? Even for those of us who call ourselves abolitionists and imagine other ways of dealing with harm, imagining not, or having to push against the desire to even dispose our enemies is incredibly difficult work. So none of this is easy. But I think it's really, we can circle back to that question of disposability later on, but I just want to encourage us to think about the relationship of this movement, the current movement to abolish police and prisons, to the historic movement to abolish racial slavery. Because the present day abolition movement is the latest phase of that unfinished struggle to abolish racial slavery in the US. So abolition in the 18th and 19th centuries meant many different things. But today, abolitionists today use the term in the sense in which anti-slavery revolutionaries employed it, which is to say that when we say abolition, we are demanding the immediate, unconditional, and total abolition of slavery and its material, penal, symbolic, and affective afterlives. So were some abolitionists like Abraham Lincoln, other members of the Republican Party, Harriet Beecher Stowe, they advocated gradual abolition. They advocated all kinds of colonization schemes that, entailed removing African descended peoples from the continent. And in opposition to that, radical abolitionists demanded, one, the immediate abolition of slavery with no compensation to slave owners. I think that's a really important point to keep in mind. Two, support for Black political, civil, and social rights. And three, assistance to fugitive slaves in the form of education, employment, and armed resistance to slave hunters and US Marshals. So at root, the revolutionary push for abolition sought to unseat the political power that Southern slaveholders had in Congress, in the Senate, in the Supreme Court. So this historical movement for abolition was a full-on assault that engaged legislative action, self and community defense, education, and a range of diverse tactics that were meant to move people toward another vision of freedom. The movement for this kind of revolutionary abolition was inspired by the actions that were undertaken by people who had been conscripted as captives into the system of transatlantic exchange and colonial capitalism. And I think this is really important to underscore, right? That abolitionists, that formal organized abolition has always begun with this kind of infrapolitical or unorganized forms of refusal and resistance, right? That take many different forms, right? So work slowdowns, running away, suicide, infanticide, economic sabotage, etc. Were practices undertaken by the enslaved. And they occurred in the journey across the Middle Passage. They occurred in the agricultural and industrial spaces of production, in domestic spaces of reproduction, across Turtle Island, otherwise known as North America. And then there were the large-scale collaborative rebellions that occurred with increasing frequency, in many corners of the Atlantic world in the 18th century. And it was this revolutionary period of the late 18th century in which freedom practices on the part of the enslaved began shifting the debate among lawmakers in metropolitan centers of colonial and post-colonial power. So after the bourgeois revolutions in the US and France, an abolitionist revolution occurred in the French colony of Saint-Domingue from 1789 to 1804. And that revolution was undertaken by enslaved people. And it established the Second Republic and the first post-slave nation state in the hemisphere, the nation of Haiti. Right, so the Haitian Revolution had a dramatic impact on the abolitionist imaginary as it began taking shape and continued taking shape, right? So it had an immense impact in the United States. Gabriel Prosser revolt that occurred during the Haitian Revolution in 1800 spread abolitionist sentiment across the United States. It was followed by other slave revolts organized by Denmark Vesey in South Carolina in 1822, the Nat Turner Revolt in Virginia in 1831, and many others, right? These insurrections and kind of the everyday work of disrupting the slave economy heralded the intensification of radical abolition that emerged alongside the expansion of slavery in the 1830s to the 1850s. And it's in this period, 1830s to the 1850s, that we see organizations like the American Anti-Slavery Society and the Feminist Anti-Slavery Society being founded to demand an immediate end to slavery, as well as for the political rights of women. So it's also important to recognize that it's within the historical abolition movement that the feminist movement in this country begins to take shape. And of course, we have ongoing abolition occurring after emancipation in 1865. We can talk about projects, the revolutionary and interracial projects that were established in the Reconstruction period as part of an abolitionist vision. But I just want to underscore the extent to which actions undertaken by those who are held captive are really the places we should be looking, right? The actions that are inspiring sort of formalized, organized abolitionist movements then and now. So as a movement, abolition has been most successful when its participants have followed the lead of those who are most impacted by its harm. And it was fugitive slaves escaping en masse from plantations that forced Lincoln to demand immediate abolition, right? And as someone living and working in California, I've been inspired by the analysis and vision of local prison abolitionists and organizations and coalitions like Critical Resistance, Decarcerate Alameda County, Arab Resource Organizing Center, California Coalition for Women Prisoners, who really start with incarcerated people and their family members in terms of what demands and strategies they engage to get us free.
Thank you, Erin. Andrea, can you tell us about abolition from your perspective?
For starters, let me say thank you for having me on this panel. I'm certainly honored and humbled to be a part of the discussion. I'd also like to acknowledge the participants in many of my projects, many of which who are operating day in and day out, night in, night out, in television space, outside of television space, in the trenches, in disadvantaged, poor, impoverished, many of which are impoverished communities, in more ways than one, as a furthering or a continuum of abolition work. That being said, abolition is in some respects subjective. There is no one absolute, except to understand that at the essence of abolitionism, it has been about disrupting. It has been about eradicating systems of white supremacy, particularly when we think about it in terms of US history. One of the things that I will just sort of zero in on, or at least provide for the sake of context, is that I think when we talk about abolition and talk about abolition within the 400 plus years of resistance here in the United States for Black folks particularly, that has in some respects perhaps shifted or varied with the context across centuries. So whether we are thinking about abolition in terms of Harriet Tubman, up through abolition with regards to W.E.B. Du Bois, or even on into the current, or a little bit before the current, I would say, with Angela Davis, Dr. Davis, or even to the current, there has been a variation of what that looked like and what it meant in terms of eradicating these institutions and these inherently racist systems and their impact on Black people. And so I would say that it's been a lot of times defined and based off of how folks across 400 centuries envisioned freedom. That would be the context in which I think about defining abolitionism, and how we might think about it or situate it in terms of moving forward, in terms of future mobilization efforts and so forth. They have often thought about abolition based, again, on the context in which they were situated and what that might mean and look like for their time frame. So for example, with Harriet Tubman, abolition certainly would have been about ending enslavement, right? Because that was the situation, that was the context. I am reminded in thinking about a quote actually from her in how she talks about once she realized that she had crossed into freedom, right? This idea of liberation and what that felt like in that particular context. And so she says, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came up like gold through the trees, and I felt like I was in heaven. So that speaks to a particular context and what she envisioned freedom to be, particularly immersed in enslavement. And so that did not mean that somehow she was escaping a white supremacist system. The nation had been built at that point through colonialism on white supremacy, on capitalism and the exploitation of people of color generally. And so that didn't change. What changed was her notion of being shackled and bound to a plantation and what that felt like and meant, and how she envisioned that moving forward for herself, for those that escaped, you know, that she that took the journey with her, and for those of us that was coming behind her. If we talked about Du Bois and how, you know, and perhaps what abolition work and disruption and eradicating these systems of enslavement in some respect, that could very well be argued as situated around the color line and the context for what race and class and those dynamics and the problems associated with maneuvering from one extreme to the other, or one extent to the other, one experience to the other surrounding the color line. And so again, I think about it within a particular context that we thought about in more recent times, perhaps with, you know, Dr. Angela Davis. Perhaps then we're gonna be talking about you know, eradicating systems surrounding capitalistic exploitive systems, white supremacist based systems surrounding prison abolition, or perhaps on into policing and so forth. So I think that what I'm ultimately saying is that the context, and so while we can have a foundational definition for what abolition has meant, for Black folks, generally speaking, in terms of liberation and freedom. I think much of those definitions and how people approach them, or how people at least talked about them, were immersed within the context of the time in which they lived, and how they envision liberation within the context and moving forward for those of us coming behind them.
Thank you very much. Ofelia?
Well, I'm just gonna, I think with the historical backdrop that's already been given, I'm just gonna kind of give I think the way that I talk about abolition initially with my students, my class, I teach a class on race in prisons and race in policing. When I introduce myself as an abolitionist, and talk about like the abolition of prisons and policing, and the first thing comes up for them obviously is, well, how do you get rid of those? How can we possibly live without those things? And what I really try to kind of at least start my classes off with is talking about abolition in the way that I best understand it is not necessarily just an absence of those, let's say, those structures and those entities, right? Although it's bigger, and I'll kind of get to that. But really, what is it that we will replace it with, or what will we build? I mean, I really do see abolition, especially right now. I mean, I think this moment, and we've talked about it in a couple different ways, this moment of crisis, this unprecedented moment, it really is, and other people have said this before, I believe, like an invitation, right? I think it's an invitation that people can really feel at this point, whether they understand what abolition is or not in the technical terms of it. And so what I think that, it is an invitation to do, it's an invitation to build. I believe it's an invitation to kind of restructure like the making of the world. I tell them it's a world making project. It's building. It's not necessarily just the disappearance of something. It's making something different. And I won't even say replace, and I won't say refurbish or rebuild. I will say world making. And that it is to kind of take on, and I think that, again, Erin and Andrea both kind of refer to this, right? It's really taking on these kind of profound insecurities and inequities in this kind of global system that is so reliant upon, this kind of production, reproduction of capital, right? And all the kinds of things that capital requires, and particularly like race, right? That it requires a particular type of racial difference, right? Like capitalism requires it, it needs it to build things. Which means that to do abolitionist work is really asking for a remaking of the world we live in what we might understand as the entire reality of the world almost. I know that's kind of an over-exaggeration of things, but, to undo, let's say, even, the harm and the violences of racial capitalism, it is an undoing of all these different, again, I think Erin and Andrea already referenced it. I mean, it is an undoing of like war making. It is dealing with our health system. It's dealing with how we live. Like, how do we find a world where we can stay alive? And it is vast. It is in all components of the way that we live that are kind of, held in, or we are confined by the workings of capital. I mean, and like, to put it out there like that, I mean, I know I'm pulling back, I'm pulling really far back from this. Because I think we can get to it too, like these other moments of abolition work. And I can talk about how I came to this, right? Which was very specific. Critical resistance was, like kind of my intro into abolitionist work. But, coming to understand it right now, again, at this particular moment, when I think that, between COVID and, the uprisings and people taking to the streets and saying, this is it, we can no longer take this, it really revealed for us. I mean, it just blew open like this idea of like capital, it doesn't work, right? It's not working. It's not working anywhere. It's global, and abolition is a global movement. It is not simply in the United States, right? It is this kind of, there's a global working of abolitionist work, I think, going on that is inherently tied to resisting like the workings of capital and the inequities that capitalism kind of places all over the world in all the specific instances. So I'm just going to make that really short, again, like, and the go away from that is it's a world making project. It's a world building project. It's a making of something. And so when I do prisons and policing in my class, I actually have the students kind of go in, build me something different, make it like, let's make a blueprint and like, let's build this with that vision, like with your imagination there and really kind of focus in on what is it that provides you security and safety? What do you feel? How do you feel you can live in the world as a fully realized kind of subject, right? Free from worry, from anxiety, from pain, from alienation. I mean, I know anybody who knows me, who might be seeing this, might not believe that I'm talking like this, and that's what I do in my class, because I don't think they see me as somebody as this kind of dreamy utopian kind of person. But it really is where I feel for me, abolition is. It's world building. It's an imagination project that can become real, because it has become real in the past practices that Erin was talking about, that Andrea was talking about. That required imagination and hope and all these other kinds of things. And so that's it. I'll just leave it with that.
Thank you, Ofelia. So the next question is actually part 2 of the same question in a sense. And the question is, what is the relationship between policing and race? And for this one, Andrea, if you'd go first.
So in my work, when I talk about the relationship between race and policing, it is absolutely historical and based off of really a plantation arrangement. The idea that there needed to be the constructing of Blackness in a particular way to justify plantation economy, right? This idea that Blackness was supposed to be defined and identified, and Black folks were supposed to be typecast and right for enslavement by virtue of inherent criminality or inherent badness. So I go back to the constructing, how Blackness in and of itself had been constructing, and how it had been constructed as a means to justify enslavement, to justify exploitation and so forth, to justify all routes taken and systems created by virtue of not having to be inclusive, by not having to count them or consider them as human, by virtue of being able to justify the very capture, in fact. And so, and also about the conquest and the capturing of land, and how that has then been dictated and relegated based off of racial categories and racial dynamics. And so policing has been about maintaining that particular order, the order of colonization, the order of maintaining economic exploitation. It has been about minimizing Black folks, particularly as being identified as a threat to these economic exploitive systems by which the nation has been built on. And so the idea of maintaining order, quote unquote, so to speak, I talk about that in my book, You Can't Stop the Revolution. In fact, I speak to much of the issues centered around this idea and this notion of maintaining order. Order for who? Order as dictated and constructed by white or through white supremacist systems. And so policing for Black folks has then meant, and so whether we're talking about formal policing or informal policing, so formal policing would then be with slave patrol, right? That was the first formal policing agency, so to speak, introduced to Black folks during enslavement. The idea, again, of constructing a particular kind of etiquette and expectation for Black folks that was certainly different and needed to be policed accordingly and different for other, or for white people. And so that meant maintaining order and maintaining a particular plantation order, a particular enslavement order, a less than human order, a not human order for Black folks through the enactment of slave codes, Jim Crow, slave codes, then Black codes, and then Jim Crow laws and so forth. The idea that by any means necessary, whether these were persons that were operating through slave patrol or individuals that were non-commissioned and just considered white citizens, the idea that we had a culture the United States culture, let me say that, had been centered and constructed on the basis of maintaining white order in such a way until there had been relegating a space. I speak to place, right? Because place is significant in terms of how Black folks had been policed, where Black folks were situated, right? Within close proximity to whiteness. Does that increase then racial threat? Or Black folks situated away from white folks? Where are you? What are you doing in those particular places as a Black person? And what has that meant? Again, whether it was legislated through the codes or in today's time, when we talk about still this expectation, this informal guide, culturally indoctrinated understanding among white populations of what Black folks should be doing and where they should be when they're doing it and with whom they should be doing those kinds of things. We certainly don't have codes in the formal sense as we would have pre-emancipation and post-emancipation in terms of Reconstruction era and so forth, but there is still an informal understanding in terms of how order or what order means and what that looks like and how to maintain it and police it and regulate it in a particular way through policy and practice for Black folks, whether it has been through the construction of the slave codes or up to the present in this indoctrinated understanding, this broad cultural socialization practice or socialization process, one after the other, in terms of white folks still engaging in regulatory or acting in ways that entitles them, or they seem to believe there's a sense of authority in terms of making sure that Black folks, and I have often talked about it as akin, again, to a plantation system. And so somebody would say, well, that's a bit extreme, right? Because Black folks are no longer on plantation. Well, that's an argument to be made, right? Like, we can still have a conversation about what enslavement looks like through transatlantic slave trade, or what it looks like in today's terms. Like, still, how are Black folks being mass numbers of Black folks being economically exploited and shackled in every sense of the imagination, being bound and chained systematically or systemically through every facet of life, whether it is incarceration, whether it is in terms of their everyday experiences on the ground, being subject to policies and so forth that hold them captured through gun violence, things that hold them captured through drugs addiction, things that hold our Black populations disproportionately lacking liberation, lacking freedom, sort of chained and confined through lack of the inability to enjoy certain freedoms that are automatically entitled and given to white populations historically. And so again, this idea of regulating Black space, or quote unquote, what has been dictated or suggested as suitable Black space versus white imagined space, and monitoring, having that be monitored, having that be regulated through policy and practice, either through formal social control mechanisms. And when I say formal social control mechanisms, I mean criminal justice system in today's terms, or informal social control systems by virtue of, again, white populations who may not be attached directly to the criminal justice system, but have a broad cultural understanding and have been socialized directly and indirectly to act in ways and engage and make assumptions and participate in the furthering of regulating and controlling Black folks across populations, and understanding that they are doing that as a help, perceiving it as a help or as a partnership, even the informal actions, perceiving it and acting upon it as a civic duty or as a partnership in tandem with formal social control systems. So they see it as helping the police. I'm doing the police a favor is oftentimes how white populations or white folks have engaged with Black people, even in today's term. So there's a broad range, and I'll talk about some more of these things as we get into some of the other questions.
Thank you, Andrea. Let's see, Ofelia, And actually, I just want to remind our viewers to please post your questions in the Q&A section and not in the chat, which was really meant to be an internal mechanism. Thank you, Ofelia.
Okay, this is a big question to take on in 4 minutes, but here I go. I'm gonna try. So I kept trying to think, how is I going to tackle this, like, you know, like expansive history? And I think, again, and this is also kind of the way in which I understand abolition, right? And as this world-making project, when I have to think of the reality of the world right now, and if I have to think of, you know, historically, what is the question is like history and policing, right?
Sorry, policing and race.
Policing and race,
Yeah.
which is historical, right? As a historical materialist, as a historical materialist, it is in, you know, so the materiality, let's say, of the US. And I kept thinking, how do I start this? And if I can just kind of, I'll go through this really quickly, but if we are to look at the police and understand what the police are, you know, they are a certain component, they fit in the structure of the idea of law, right? Law as idea, law as it manifests on the ground in the material reality of law. And law is, you know, and this is not me, Derrida does a better kind of accounting of this, but, you know, within law, there is the inherent force of violence, right? Like law is nothing but authorized violence. I mean, it's not me that says, I mean, I think it's Locke who basically says, you know, that the power, the political power, the power of politics or political power is basically embedded in the right and the legal right of like the penalty of death. And that's Locke, that's not me. I mean, he readily admits to the violence that is inherent within the practice of law, right? And so when I'm teaching and I'm talking about policing, and, you know, I make them kind of pull back a little bit and trying to understand, well, what are these components of law? And there is this component of it that is, quote unquote, I will put in quotation, the administration of justice. Meaning here is, quote unquote, justice handed out, your prison sentence, so to speak. When you go before a judge and you go to court and then you're imprisoned. Before that, to me, is where this kind of inherent force of law is. And that is, for me, in my work, from policing to jail, which is why I write about the jail as well as policing, and I write about them as very separate things. And in that violence, and in this kind of policing violence that is, again, the function of law, I think it's important to also consider, and I swear to God, I'm gonna get to this really quick, is that law is, and what makes us understand even things, because if I have to go back and kind of deal with dismantling capitalism, you know, it was like Bentham that basically said, you know, property is nothing but law, right? Property doesn't exist without law. There is no property without law. Law is, he says something like property is born in law and it dies in law, which also means that the force and the violence has to be in it. It does not exist. And I would say the same thing with war. I mean, my students know that I talk about war as nothing but accumulation of law, right? It is just this hyperaccumulation, this explosion of law. And, you know, in that, to say that property is nothing but law is to also kind of acknowledge, well, what is the importance of property? Like, how is it and why does it need to be protected? So all you have to do is go back and read those old guys, read Locke, read Smith. Those guys said this stuff. I didn't. Benjamin, Derrida, they kind of dismantle it to kind of really push away from this idea. And I think this is what we kind of come up against right now, which maybe we can get into later, is this kind of very liberal idea that law is supposed to provide, you know, order, safety, prevent us from chaos. And yet we keep scratching our heads and we keep looking at this, like this violence of policing, whether it's legal or extra legal, scratching our heads now going, how can we possibly keep letting this happen? How are we watching it right in front of our eyes? And it still keeps going on and on and on and on and on. And I think it is that notion, this understanding, one, that law, which is what reform relies upon is this, again, this very liberal understanding that law is supposed to be the thing that protects us and takes care of us. But it never really can. It can't do it because of the violence in it. So in the idea of property, and I will just say this is where it kind of connects to race for me. And when I speak to my classes about race and policing, I talk about it as like kind of understanding it as this geohistorical project. And that policing can transmorph and morph itself and transition in all these different kinds of ways related to the way in which property or other kinds of capital is accumulated, right? And one of the examples I give, because and again, with prisons, we talk about, the plantation, the Native American reservation, and the mission system as the kind of early precursors to prisons, right? And to kind of look at policing the same way, I use the example of like one of the earliest kind of modern, what becomes a modern structure of policing, the Texas Rangers, who were kind of instituted as a colonial, what I will call a colonial policing force. They were Rangers. They were kind of instituted in 1823 to kind of, basically protect the settlers that came into what becomes the Texas Republic. 20 years later, they are actually like key players in the US-Mexico War, one of the first wars that develops like the nation-state boundary, right, of the United States. And in that making, let's just say, and there's other things to talk about, but again, in terms of history, this is how the police keep continually being attached to race, is first the Texas Rangers function as kind of a colonial soldiering force that is to protect different ideas of what sovereignty is. And the minute that the United States, creates this nation state boundaries and encloses itself as one country, those Texas Rangers then become criminal police. And the same people that they were fighting in terms of sovereignty, Native American people and Mexicans, then become criminals, and they become cattle robbers, train robbers, et cetera, right? Then criminality kind of takes the place of the threat of, to the nation state sovereignty. So that is all to say that it has to become racialized, much in the same way that Andrea was talking about, that process of racialization to racialize Mexicans and Native Americans, to become at first they were threats to this building of the nation state as their own sovereign subjects, and then to become criminal, then technically not racialized, but a criminal subject, was also part of that production of race, right? That it continues for whatever folks that are in the way of like this accumulation of capital. And then that is how the race happens, right? It happens everywhere, and it happens in accordance to what is the kind of geohistorical project at that moment, right? It's not just encapsulated into just one area or one kind of origin space. So that's all I wanted to say about it.
Thank you. Erin?
Trying to think about how to follow up on the heels of Andrea and Ophelia's rich discussion of the entanglement of policing and racialization. I guess, it's commonly known that policing is a direct descendant of slave patrols, as, has already been mentioned. And I always remind people that it goes back further than that English capitalists invented policing to enforce the enclosures and protect private property. And so, as Ofelia has laid out for us, capital can't accumulate without policing forces, right? And as Andrea has gone over for us so eloquently, we do the work of policing ourselves and each other. And I think, it was Ruthie Gilmore in an interview recently began the interview by calling out the person who called the cops on George Floyd, right? Because we were in the midst of an uprising, and many of us had seen the video of George Floyd's lynching, and it was very much, we were very focused on the people in uniform, right? In those blue threads, who had been given the authority by the state to kill George Floyd. But it began with that person in that store calling the police when they suspected that they had been handed a counterfeit bill, right? So, I think people are paying more attention to the ways that policing is atmospheric, right? It's distributed. We all engage in it in different forms. And, we've become more aware of that kind of distributed atmospheric policing function, also because of all of the Barbecue Becky videos that have been circulating, white women in parks and in neighborhoods calling police on children, and people just, literally living their lives. And I think it's worth it to think about, to connect to Ophelia's discussion of law and Andrea's discussion of law, and think about the relationship between formal state, state organized violence and then extra legal forms of violence, and the forms of lawfare that legitimate kinds of violence that we are seeing increasingly, that some of us recognize as illegitimate, right? But that somehow the law continues to legitimize. So my work is around lynching culture in the US, and deeply embedded in the work of radical anti-lynching organizers like Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois, and members of the Communist Party like Harry Haywood, who were very explicit about the relationship between racial capitalism and organized violence, and the capitalist state's reliance on paramilitary forces like the Ku Klux Klan, and various bodies that engaged in night watches in the aftermath of emancipation. So to refer to the Ku Klux Klan as a paramilitary organization, which it is, I think does some of the kind of abolitionist imaginary work that we need to do to make connections between elements of our society that are seen to be disparate, but that have in fact always been working together. So in the wake of emancipation, we have new subjects who have been named citizens of the United States, whose subject status as racialized beings was thrown into crisis, right? So after enslavement formally ends, a lot of people didn't know how to categorize Black people. Suddenly we have nominally free subject population, and how this population would fit into a citizenry that had previously been white was very threatening to a lot of people, right? So this process of criminalization that Ofelia is talking about was pretty much enacted through immense, insane amounts of organized violence, massacres and lynchings that didn't get named lynchings until the 1880s, but were happening immediately following emancipation, right? So we have massacres in Memphis, massacres in New Orleans, because Black people are organizing alongside people of many ethnic backgrounds to resist the takeover of their lives by the forces of capitalist accumulation, right? So we have farmers who are demanding that they sustain themselves by growing their own food and just taking care of each other. And if you were a Black person and you demanded that you grow your own food and feed your own family, you could be charged with vagrancy and locked up, and then emancipated by somebody who will pay your bail, and then you're indebted to them for the rest of your life, right? So this kind of lawfare, the instantiation of the Black codes in 1865 after emancipation as an extension of the slave codes, as a way to criminalize behavior that pushes against the planter class and its cooperation with Northern capitalists to force people into signing labor contracts that would keep them employed by people who had formerly enslaved them, right? So the mechanization of criminalization, or I should say racialization of Black people after emancipation took place through organized violence on the part of members of the state and paramilitary organizations, and then also through these kinds of the criminalization of all kinds of behavior through the Black codes. But it's important to acknowledge that it's not just the kind of spectacular violence that we see that is part and parcel of this racialization, right? A lot of violence that happens in the shadows that we don't see, that we don't hear about, that people don't like to talk about, is also really integral to these forces of racialization. So rape, widespread campaigns of rape that were undertaken by police officers, by members of the Ku Klux Klan, by night watchmen, entering into people's homes, much like we see today, police officer entering into Breonna Taylor's home, entering into the homes of Andrea Boyles and other women, Eleanor Bumpurs being attacked in her home in the 1980s, an elderly disabled Black woman, right? These home raids, entrance of state officers into people's homes is a continuation of the kinds of attacks that happened in Black homes in the early Reconstruction period, and through which terror was spread throughout communities. And so I just want to kind of underscore that relationship between extra-legal and legal organized violence.
Okay.
And this punishment complex that emerges during the Reconstruction period.
So I think Ofelia has a reply, and then just to give you a heads up, we only have about 15 minutes left and 2 more big questions, which I'll try to combine into one. But
yeah, I just, I think Erin, I just want to kind of like follow like 2 things that Erin said, I think, to kind of show again, like this, the way that race and policing kind of work together, and there's this kind of continuity along with there being discontinuities. And one of them is when Erin said, because I also talk about my class, how like there's moments in which, and again, this actually goes back to what Andrea said too, like moments of disruption where all of a sudden a population has to get dealt with. Like, who are they? I think that's what Erin said, like, who are they? You've got to figure out who these folks are. And again, just to kind of go back to, so for, again, another example in the West is after the US-Mexico War, guys, so close to what Erin was saying, and I hadn't thought about it this way before, was, here are these folks, Mexican people who they did not know how to identify, right? They were like, oh, who are these? What do we do with them? I mean, how do we incorporate it at that time, at that project? Again, because geography, I was telling my class, geography means so much. It is vastly different west of the Mississippi, right? It's just this open space. There aren't cities, there aren't colleges, there aren't all these kinds of things that existed. And there was this grappling, what do we do and who do we call these people? And right away it was like, well, we need white folks to populate this area, so let's just call them white, right? We'll just call Mexican folks white. It works for us. And then the way in which the settlement happens then relies on this very much this kind of same racial logic that was used in the South, lynchings, public hangings, lynchings in particular, but function in a different way. And I think that's the other point that Erin brought up. They weren't so much, when you look at lynchings and hanging in the West, they weren't so much these big spectacles of terror where like thousands of people would be invited to come and talk. They were a process of eradication. I mean, they were just about killing people off, which is also why it's made it very hard to count, take the count of how many people were lynched in the West, right? It was an eradication thing. It wasn't to try to do social control through the spectacle of terror. It was about just removing people. And so I think that what that points to, again, is just always kind of paying close attention to the way that policing works, to always adjust itself. For some reason, it can always adjust itself to what is the population management project at hand? What is it at that moment that we need to do, not me, to manage this population to fit in this larger project of racial capitalism, colonial capitalism, to this accumulation of capital. And you can watch it. If you watch, and I tell my students this, if you watch certain moments, things will shift and change accordingly, right? It's why when Erin even said, when we talk about the scope of policing, we can include, I can turn the Texas Rangers into like Border Patrol policing. It is still all roughly the same project. And that like, I think to kind of start convincing people that this isn't just some kind of to always mark the moment in which the accumulation of capital might have a moment of disruption, which I actually think we are in right now. And then watch it shift and morph itself to either create a different criminal subject. Mexicans become criminalized as bandits because we just were trying to get stuff and keep stuff, and Native folks were criminalized in a different kind of way to create. It happens across, as a comparativist, that's what I do. It's like I kind of watch the way that all folks get incorporated and policed in the United States, but there's one kind of thing that is continuous, and it is, how do we manage populations to always control for the accumulation of capital? And I think right now, I don't think there's a simple answer. I do think there's something different going on. I think that we rely on different ways to talk about police violence right now that feel like things that happened before, but I do believe it's different. I believe it's different, and I can talk about that later, because there is one thing I want to point out about us watching and maybe witnessing policing violence that has to do with it. But Erin just said a couple of things, but I was trying to take notes quick, going like, oh my gosh, yes, that's true. That's, and it happens, you can see it happening across the United States, almost like replicating itself, but adjusting itself to that population. That's the continuity. The discontinuity, the disruptions end up being different, but the initial project, again, that I think is embedded in these ideas of property and law, those don't change. And population management doesn't, the need, or the quote unquote need for it doesn't change, I think. So thanks, Erin. I wrote down this stuff you said. I gotta ask you about it later.
So we have about, and because I want to leave enough time for the Q&A. So let's say we have about 10 minutes left, and I have 2 questions, but I'm gonna read shortened versions of both, and you can kind of decide what you want to answer to. And we'll start with Andrea. So the first question is about the day-to-day. What does abolition look like on a day-to-day basis? Meaning there's groundswells and uprisings that last for a defined period of time, but what's the work that precedes and that follows these uprisings, so that when they happen, activists can take advantage of them and actually move forward? And the second question is, and it's somewhat related, how do you see the movement advancing? And in light of recent arrests and debate over reform, what are your thoughts about the future of the movement, this movement, and or the state of race, policing, and abolition moving forward? So again, choose one or the other to answer, or some combination of the two. Andrea, we'll start with you.
So let me say this. I want to provide just a little bit of context again and sort of reiterate. So as a sociologist and critical criminologist, I want to make this, and this is going to be kind of firm, but I want to be clear, crystal clear to the audience. It is my argument in the spirit of, as a critical theorist and in the spirit of revolution, that the policing institution in and of itself has never been in favor of Black population. It has not been constructed in any facet of the imagination in the best interest of Black people. It was enacted for the sake and for the benefit and in protection of white interests. So I want to make that clear. In terms of law, I also want to argue and make very, very clear that in my work and throughout my position as a critical theorist, a critical criminologist and sociologist, is that in terms of law has never been inherently created in the best interest of Black people. You cannot construct laws by virtue of slave codes, Black codes, Jim Crow, and then somehow on a back end say, but it has benefited. It has never inherently, from the construction of the 400 years in which this panel speak, it has never been constructed in US history in the benefits of Black people. So there's a history that precedes United States, of course, but my focus and my work has been on the 400 years, and it's never in any facet of critical theory or revolutionary position has it benefited or been in the interest of Black people generally or broadly, and that is by virtue of policy or practice. It has been tweaked in some ways to be inclusive superficially, but it has never been constructed. It was never created by virtue considering the interests of Black people. And it has been Black folks all along that have long fought to call attention to it. I also, in terms of the day-to-day, one of the things I also want people to know is I am a Black citizen police conflict expert. I also am the sociologist and critical criminologist that was on the ground following Brown's death, just within hours of his murder. And so that provides a different lens through which I account for many things compared to theorists or other researchers that came thereafter. I waited with Brown's, some of Brown's family members and the early gathering of the Black community as we waited and stood there for the crime tape to come down. There were many things I was able to capture in those exchanges that never got picked up in the media, was never accounted for in terms of how we think about day-to-day resistance, how we think about in terms of the broader resistance and mobilization. They weren't accounted for. And so I was able to pull those things in. And so what I would tell you is that of the many things that I was able to account for in the very first few hours before the world understood who Mike Brown was, before the world understood what Ferguson was or where it existed and what that meant, there were a number of things that came out of. First and foremost, the call for action, the initial calls of action did not singularly situate around just Black citizen police conflict. The initial calls of action from organizers was also inclusive of interpersonal neighborhood violence and a number of other things. And so oftentimes what we get is part of that. And the reality of it is what it becomes is erasure for Black resistance, because there are pieces that are missing in terms of the initial mobilization effort and calls for action that aren't accounted for or considered to be important. Black folks have been on the ground well before and during and after Brown's death, in trenches, working in what I term and refer to as informal integration, and working also through formal participation in ways to account for or counter institutional discrimination, institutional, inherently racist, structural ineptness. And so they do that every day. I think what people have gotten caught into or sort of become captured by is what I have termed as the show, right? The exchanges with police militarization and what that means and looks like. And so what I want folks to understand is that Black folks are not just working on the front lines. They're not just bodies on the line when we watch CNN or MSNBC or these other, or behind or after the emergence of, a Black murder by police. Black folks are in the trenches and on the ground, also doing work back in the neighborhood, in between the exchanges of rubber bullets and tear gas, feeding the hungry, or clothing the clothless, taking in folks who don't have shelter, working those angles as well in terms of organizing and activism. Folks are doing that in many respects. Many go from literally direct action in the street to navigating those kinds of organization and efforts in the trenches on regular, back on regular streets. When I say regular streets, meaning back in the neighborhood. There is this sense of solidarity that takes place there, this sort of, and I talk about social ties and the coming together and this form of navigating. And I want to especially, call that out. There's just not enough time to really get into the thick of it all. But one of the things I especially want to sort of call out is the fact that more often than not, theories and so forth have hinged or sort of been centered around this idea that Black folks don't come together. Black folks somehow are only only bothered and disturbed when it comes to a police killing of a Black person. Anything beyond that is irrelevant in the Black community, or these ideas that Black folks can't come together to check for their own neighborhoods and those kinds of things. That is absolutely not what I found in my work. It is often not talked about and discussed. And the Black movement and resistance is not limited to police Black citizen conflict. It is broad, it has depth. There are many approaches. There's no monolithic angle in terms of how resistance is accomplished. The root of it is about freedom and liberation, but what that looks like and how it plays out in their everyday existence far extends beyond the exchanges that we see on national TV.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I guess, Ofelia, why don't you go next and try to keep it.
Okay, I'm gonna go quick. I'll try to go quick. It was about what is our day-to-day practice of abolition? Okay, Well, two things. I want to do a plug for Hart Hall because I feel like this is one of my practices too. Hart Hall, where the ethnic studies and gender studies and all of the kind of resistant departments are located, are having a town hall meeting on July 15th. And one of the things we're actually talking about is, because the students brought it to the table, is Hart Hall being free of police and creating Hart Hall as a space that will be police free. And we can't deal with the whole campus yet, but we know that we can start in Hart Hall, right? And my abolition work, you know, my day-to-day practice here in the neighborhood where I live in Sacramento, it's kind of maybe kind of instituting or replicating a lot of work that I did in Cop Watch back in the day when I lived in the Bay Area, which, and a little bit in Los Angeles, right? Trying to replicate that here in Sacramento on my own. And then in my classroom, I mean, and I will say this is an abolitionist project, and it kind of goes back to this kind of imagining and how to use things. I have this assignment called the Get Your Money Back assignment, Get Your Money Back, is what I call it, reimagining or reversing prisons. And I have my students, and I do believe this is one way to kind of start, is I have my students do research, pick a state prison, find out how much it costs to build, maintain it, and hold an inmate, and spend that money, because it is a state structure, as the UC is. As UC Davis is a state structure, so is the CDC. And, you know, being in the UC system during the 1990s and watching, you know, this massive prison building project take place in California and change this state, the 5th largest economy in the world, in some ways rests on the prison building project here. That was like one of the big, you know, one of the kind of like the ground zero in some ways for the prison industrial complex. I have them do the research about how much it costs. And then with all the things that I ask them, really, what could you see that would provide you safety and security? And we meditate on this, we spend time. I do this kind of, again, something that maybe my friends might be surprised about. What makes you feel safe and secure when you go to bed at night? And it is, I call home, my parents are there. I have my phone works, I can pay for my books, I'm gonna get fed, there's a park I can go to. I mean, I fill the board up with 100 different things. Never in the 6 years that I've been doing this project has prisons and police made that list when I have them focus and meditate. And so I tell them, you take that money and build me something that will give you that safety and security. All these things you talked about, going to the park, clean water, my friends, this, and I build me something in your wildest imagination with that same amount of money. And, you know, that is the closest I can kind of come to put this in practice, man. That money belongs to us. And I understand some limitations about the idea of the state and whatnot, but like, that's what I do. I can do this in the classroom. And Hart Hall, we're gonna start. We're gonna try to get, you know, join our meeting. I'll post it if anybody's interested in our town hall meeting. It's coming up in 2 weeks, so.
Thank you, that's great. Okay, Erin, you can close us up and then we'll open up to questions, but yeah.
So abolition on a day-to-day basis. I mean, like Andrea said, you know, the revolution will not be televised, and you know, the moment that we're in right now was made possible because abolitionists have been educating and organizing for the last 2 decades. And it's been amazing to see that it's, you know, at least some of this labor has worked and is having an impact. And, you know, abolitionists say again and again that, you know, even though it's a big kind of world-making mission, right? It's a revolution, it's an overturning, and that's incredibly difficult, but we also can make freedom out of the tools that we have, right? We have examples of abolitionist praxis all around us if we know how to apprehend it, right? So, you know, it's a matter of organizing kind of on the ground with people in your communities, having a conceptualization of how those grounded actions link up to, you know, bigger moves that are happening worldwide. But essentially, you know, how do we make freedom out of what we have now, and how do we do it without sacrificing anybody? 2 questions I think we need to ask ourselves again and again every single day to remind ourselves. Number 1, you know, you can work in your neighborhoods to create no police zones. Like Ofelia is mentioning that Hart Hall wants to ban police from Hart Hall. I'm hoping we can ban police from the University of California altogether. But you know, starting small, and in order to be able to make an agreement with your neighbors, for example, that nobody will call the police on each other or on anybody who comes into the neighborhood. In order to do that, you have to put a system of care in place so that when harm does occur, you know who to call. So that, you know, that's one way to begin building abolition on a kind of everyday basis, is building relationships with people that are in your everyday life, right? And creating the conditions so that you can administer care for each other and not have to call the police. And I guess I'll say, what else do I want to say? I guess I'm interested in, I know that we're running out of time, but just talking about the limitations of a lot of the reforms that are happening right now in the name of abolition, right? So abolitionist labor is being co-opted by, you know, progressive forces, liberal forces, democratic forces, who are just shifting money around within budgets, right? So the LA County budget, you know, city councilors are saying they're cutting the budget, and you know, they're moving money into other areas of the budget for policing, right? Earmarking it for policing and calling it something else, right? So we have to be really savvy about how money gets moved around. And of course, not just allowing for the defunding to happen, but we need to invest in other practices, right? And abolitionist ways of being. So another reform that's concerning to me is that Governor Kemp just signed a hate crimes bill in Georgia, right? And this was lauded as a victory for Black people and for other people of color in the state of Georgia. Abolitionists have been arguing for years that hate crime laws that criminalize individual action actually doesn't push an abolitionist agenda, right? If we understand acts of organized racist violence to be individualized crimes, it's going to move us away from engaging in systemic critique. And it also just puts more money into policing, right? So we have to be very careful in the kinds of reforms that we engage in, right? And be able to distinguish between reformist reforms and abolitionist reforms, and be really cautious about you know, what language we're using to describe things and what we agree to. And I just want to say right now that you know, also on an everyday basis, you know, figure out what's happening in your local schools. Oakland United School Board just voted to kick cops out of schools. Same thing happened in San Francisco. A lot of youth are organizing in really wonderful, radical ways. And I think, you know, having conversations with young people in your neighborhoods is essential, you know, on an everyday basis. So what are kids dreaming of? How do kids envision abolition? To me is a really important question to think about. And then supporting people who are supporting people inside prisons, right? And their loved ones who are you know, struggling to support people inside. There's a crisis. I mean, we're all in, you know, dealing with this pandemic right now, but you know, the state is making people inside prisons very, very sick. And a hunger strike just started in San Quentin to call attention to the thousands of cases of COVID that are now inside of that prison.
Okay, thank you, Erin. Thank you, all three of you. And we're going to move on to the Q&A. There's quite a few questions, and we'll probably get to one or two. So there's, let's see, I'll combine a couple of different questions about visibility and invisibility. So what and who is rendered invisible in the media and in movements themselves? And then another question kind of related to that: how have media helped us to witness police violence? What is the interplay of visibility and invisibility in our world now? And I'll just open the floor. Who wants to go first?
I'll go.
Great.
I'll say that invisibility in terms of the media is troubling, both for in resistance space for Black folks, with whether they are in their communities or actually in their communities, their everyday, the everyday effort, right, that we just talked about in their communities. Like, it's not provocative to watch what I refer to as community other mothers and other mothers, Black women, provide shelter and bring community along in various ways, feed the hungry folks on their block. That's not provocative. So those kinds of efforts and actions, that is also about countering systems, countering these very racist systems are not captured. And so the other part of invisibility that I will speak to is also intellectual invisibility. And so the idea of accounting for, or at least acting in community engagement. And when I say community engagement, I mean the idea of spending time and accounting for Black experiences versus in a way that is meaningful to their community, meaningful to our community. I talk about those dynamics and how community folks, organizers and otherwise think about us academic folks, think about researchers and so forth. So I talk about those kinds of things. They don't always, and not particularly about giving glowing remarks, because there is an exploitive relationship that they are very well aware of. And so I talk about checking pearls at the door and actually getting into the community if we're going to, even as academics or even in intellectual space, make visible or expand these platforms for disadvantaged Black people and what that looks like in terms of police work or otherwise. The other thing I would say is even me as a criminologist and sociologist, I provide a framework. I didn't just account for the interactions within Ferguson in a, or account for the exchanges in that particular way. I actually worked to expand and offer a post-Ferguson framework because I understood the dynamics on the ground and that there would be, again, unfortunately, another set of circumstances that there would need to be a continuum of resistance. And so I offer a post-Ferguson framework by which is about expanding. That becomes invisible. People have some ways, so when we talk about theories and we talk about the canons, or when we talk about frameworks, what faces do we see? I, as a Black woman, as a Black academic, as the authority on the ground in empirical space, I work to expand the framing, the framework, and I presented it in a way that was consistent with the findings and consistent with the experiences of the Black community, rather than projecting. And so those kinds of things, I think, are all examples of invisibility and ways in which one of the participants in my project talks about revolutionary tasks. Everybody should be operating or have a revolutionary task. And so that those kinds of things, expanding framework, expanding the discipline, carving out space. It has been a revolutionary task for me based on the findings of actual community engagement.
Thank you. Do Ofelia or Erin, do you want to also answer this question, or should I move on to another one? We can spend all our time on this one. It's an important one. I mean, they all are.
Well, I can just say really quickly that I think one of the things that gets obfuscated the most violently is the extent to which racial capitalism depends on gender violence. And so, there's, we typically hear about the killings of Black men, and we know that we hear a lot less about the killings of Black women, and especially Black trans women, and other gender nonconforming people who are facing, immense amounts of violence, and people don't respond to those killings in the same way. And, I think we could have a really long conversation about the impact that video of Floyd's killing had on the ability of people to come together in the way that they did. But I think we need to have, really deep conversations about whose lives we value and whose lives we don't value, even within communities of color, or especially within all of our communities. And I guess the other thing that, well, maybe I'll just leave it there and let Ofelia pick up the question.
Well, I think I'm going to put something out there, and I'm hoping to be able to talk to Andrea and Erin like as a follow-up to this, because, you know, the book, my first book, is like about like watching, right? It is, one of the chapters is on this photo art book museum exhibition Without Sanctuary, which was about lynching photographs, but it wasn't about the photographs themselves. It was more about how it was seen, the exhibition of those, how it was interpreted by folks in the year 2000 were kind of in this different space, and stories like of redemption and reconciliation and all this project that was going on at the same time. And it's how I end my book, the television show Cops, and as well as the prison, you know, mass incarceration, what do they call it? Prison industrial complex. I don't use that anymore. So it's like, I forget, you know, is at its height. And I kind of juxtapose those two things to kind of call out this question is, what does this really mean right now, right? When there's these stories about this old history, and then you watch a television show Cops. But in that, I look at other visual documentations against Native people, against Mexican folks, against Asian, like all these different types of racial violence that take place, not just lynching. But I will put this on the table because I have to think about this. And, you know, it's like the world watches this now, right? We all see it. And in the past, like let's say these past practices, from what I understand, and I'm not a lynching expert, I'm not, because it's a whole field and there's total experts in the field, and I'm not. You know, audiences weren't kind of heterogeneous, right? They weren't mixed crowds per se that were going and watching. Somebody wasn't a safe place to be. And now everybody's watching. Like everybody's seen it. The policemen themselves it's, you know what I mean? It's not a homogeneous black and white anymore. Whether the witnesses and the viewers, as well as the police and the practitioners. The constant is the body of color, I think. But I think it raises questions is like, what does this mean now? That we're all watching. We're all in the audience watching this. And even, I'll just again, I think this is a question I'm just putting on the table. Sometimes I watch these videos and I have this big collection because it's my research. It's horrible kind of sitting in my computer, but I often think about the folks that are actually videotaping. And as I sit and watch, I'm kind of like, why aren't you stopping it? Why aren't you just throwing your phone down and like throwing a rock or you know what I mean? There's these different components at work now that I swear I don't have answers to. I do not. But I think that they need to be thought through, because I think there'll be answers in how we can work at this, the actual witnessing and the way that it's different nowadays. I'm just kind of put that on the table because it is different. I don't, you know, I think it's different, and I think that has to be dealt with. And I don't think it's been dealt with, but it kind of implicates us all in some ways.
Well, Ofelia, I can tell that we're going to have some many conversations after this one. And I will say that lynch mobs and crowds were not homogeneous. There actually were people of color, you know, including Black people in some lynch mobs. You know, you look at photographs and you actually do see Black people in those crowds. But I think your question about what it means to have this kind of racial violence being mediated the way it is now in the 21st century through cell phone cameras and on the internet, you know, is one that we all need to be having. And I thought of two other things that get it completely invisibilized, nearly completely, which is policing violence against Indigenous communities in the United States. You know, far outpaces police violence against Black people. Nobody really talks about that. I mean, obviously Indigenous people talk about that, but the rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women, also something that gets invisibilized. And then the violence of policing globally. I mean, levels of lynching in Brazil are off the charts, right? At the same time that, you know, we know that police and the military are engaging in brutal forms of racialized violence. And so having these conversations, you know, between organizers in different parts of the world who are facing this kind of violence is really necessary, especially as we seek to hopefully transcend the, the nation state in its current form.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm really torn here because there's some really great questions, including one I know from an audience member who's posed several questions about examples of alternative policing. Are there any that you can speak about, including here in Yolo County or in Davis? But it's 5:26. So I don't know if somebody has a very quick answer to that question.
What was it again?
What examples already exist of alternative policing or alternates to policing, if you can give a sort of concrete example, and also defunding and abolition of the police, if there are concrete, important examples that we can look at. But I'm thinking that's going to be a longish answer.
I can give a really quick one.
What's that?
It's an extensive question. Well, yeah, it's a broad question, but I will tell you this: in my work, what I have found is that Black folks are engaging in alternatives to policing every day. Folks make conscious decisions. On some level, there are instances where people will dial 911, but in many respects, people have worked to find ways in which to avoid dialing 911. They are navigating and negotiating, between themselves, between neighbors and otherwise, because people don't want to find themselves either facing convictions. I mean, some of the participants in my projects have reported free casings, meaning the police show up on them and drop drug cases on them, things like it. So folks are running because they have decided that they would rather take chances and run than stay put and, have an exchange with the police, because that could be an increased threat. So there are many ways. Again, I won't go into a bunch of specifics. I will just tell you there are ways in which people have navigated and found safer means or routes, at least, that worked best for their block, for their their communities and otherwise, without necessarily dialing 911.
And in fact, in Minneapolis, this is happening on the ground in Minneapolis, and it's a good segue into our next event, which is tentatively set for Thursday, July 23rd. It actually is going to feature a group of people on the ground in Minneapolis making all sorts of alternate realities happen. And it's called, tentatively again, Building a Police-Free City, Insights from Minneapolis. So I think to our viewers who had these questions, there'll be a further discussion of that in our next event. And please do check our website for updates, for information on that event, to join our mailing list. And I want to thank our panelists so much for joining us and for sharing your experiences and your wisdom and just being present here with us. And thank you to all our viewers. And please do check the DHI website, which is dhi.ucdavis.edu. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.